Hello and welcome back to Politics World. I'm Sam Scribala. We live in interesting and unpredictable times. Catalan independence may be on the horizon. Uber have lost their London licence. And the Labour Party Conference is set to start this weekend. Oh, did I mention the German election is on Sunday? Well, we start our new series with a look at the Liberal Democrats, who concluded their own party conference in Bournemouth earlier this week. Under new leader Sir Vince Cable, the party have looked to establish themselves as the Party of Remain, referring, of course, to Brexit. Yet the Lib Dems are still in single digits, although hope seemingly remains high amongst the party faithful. With Brexit set to dominate the headlines for months and years to come, the UK's most pro-EU party will likely continue to remain relevant. I am now joined by Lib Dem activist and the editor of Lib Dem Voice, Caron Lindsay. Caron, welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you for having me on.
So, the Lib Dems just concluded their party conference in Bournemouth. What do you feel about the current state of the Liberal Democrats?
I think the week in Bournemouth, as always, it's always great to spend a week with your friends by the seaside, so that's going to make you happy for a start. But I think we've come away from conference kind of with confidence and energised, because we know how important it is to do everything we can to try and stop Brexit. Vince has had three things to do over the few days in Bournemouth. The first was to establish the Liberal Democrats very, very firmly as the anti-Brexit party, and he did that very, very strongly. And the language that he's using is much stronger than the language we were using during the general election. The second thing he had to do was just to remind everybody how wise and credible and authoritative he is, reminding people that he was the one who predicted the financial crash, how the Liberal Democrats have so often been on the right side of the arguments in things like the Iraq War and again the financial crash. The third thing he had to do was to put out something that was advance an agenda that was very different from Brexit. And that he talked a lot about inequality, and he talked a lot about intergenerational inequality and doing something for young people. And I think what was very, very interesting was that he actually, it was always been the Liberal Democrats have talked about electoral reform as the very first thing we would want in reforming politics. And he's said that actually the first thing we want now is votes for 16 and 17-year-olds.
Well, obviously there's been a lot of optimism amongst the party faithful as of late, energised, as you mentioned, with a new leader in the form of Sir Vince Cable. Yet at the moment, looking at the polls, the Lib Dems tend to be in single digits. Is the message simply not getting out there, or has there been a problem with the party's platform?
I think that's all being sorted now. I think that we have a much more robust message than we did during the election. We just weren't heard during the election. I mean, I always said that I thought Tim Farron should have said on the 18th of April, when Theresa May called the election, right, see if I walk into Downing Street as Prime Minister on the 9th of June, the very first thing I'm going to do is revoke Article 50. He should have been very strongly anti-Brexit. And that didn't really cut across. It was just like, oh well, we really don't like Brexit, and we want people to we want there to be another referendum. And I think that was the election really was a bit too early. I think since then the government have just been embarrassing us on a daily basis in the Brexit negotiations, made such a mess of it, and people are now, I think, starting to think again. There was a poll in the Independent this week that showed that 52% of people wanted to remain or would vote to remain if there was another referendum tomorrow. But I think public opinion is shifting in our favour, and a stronger anti-Brexit message will help that. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting this week is that Vince Cable is now the most popular political leader in the country. In fact, he's almost in positive figures. So that's a good move for somebody who's only been in office for 2 months.
Well, of course, Brexit has been the defining issue, both in British politics and certainly for the Lib Dems since last June, in his speech to conference table, obviously said the Lib Dems were the party of Remain and called for a, quote, first referendum on the facts.
Yes, so that's a nice little Vinceism there.
So, as you mentioned, are the party now the party of Remain? That sort of seems to be the way they're going.
Absolutely. We had a debate last Sunday morning on, just particular ways. There's two options of how we might take this forward. But what was very clear is that the party is absolutely unified in that we just don't want to see Brexit happen. There might have been a little bit of disagreement on how we wanted to take it forward. Some people wanted to just say, go straight out and say, right, we would just revoke Article 50 if we had a Lib Dem government. Whereas the leadership were saying, no, we need to take this forward by way of a referendum, which is actually probably the more sensible policy, even though I voted the other way.
But what would you say to those who said we had a referendum last year and it's been voted on? Brexit was voted for, and surely that would entail leaving the single market and the customs union.
Well, no, actually, that wasn't on the ballot paper. And in fact, certain of the Brexiteers actually said, no, we could stay in the single market, we could stay in the customs union. There wasn't a plan. And I know from having been through the Scottish independence referendum, that the SNP produced this massive plan for independence. Honestly, it was the size of a house brick, and it was delivered to every household in the country at vast cost. So they knew they had set out exactly what independence, what Scotland being an independent country would mean. Brexiteers had some numbers on the side of a bus, some fake numbers on the side of a bus, and I think. This is how the reality is far from what was promised to us. We're not going to get £350 million a week for the NHS. We are going to be poorer. We are already poorer. And you can see today that already, again, the credit rating has been, the country's credit rating has been downgraded. Which is going to make it more expensive for the country to borrow money to invest, which is, not good at all. So, there are all sorts of consequences of the Brexit vote that people really weren't aware of at the time. So all we're saying is that the Brexiteers are so confident in their position, they should just go to the country and say, okay, is this what you wanted? And the country can then say, yeah, it is, or they can say, no, it's not, and we want to stay in the European Union because we see that that's the best option for our country.
Obviously, as you mentioned, the credit rating was downgraded yesterday after Theresa May's speech in Florence, which I think would be best described as a reluctant leavers speech. Now, what did you make of the guarantee that the UK will remain in what should be at least a transitional arrangement until 2021?
Well, what I'm worried about is this is going to be the ground on which we're arguing, which is basically going to be the Tories and the Tory hardcore Brexiteers and Theresa May fighting like rats in a sack over the length of the transitional period. That's kind of irrelevant. The cliff is still there. When we come to the end of the transitional period, there is still going to be a massive cliff for us to follow. We're not going to be in the single market. We're not going to be in the customs union if Theresa May has her way. And that is really serious for this country's prosperity. And kicking the can further down the road really doesn't make it any less unpleasant.
Now, in the speech as well, Sir Vince Cable did say that the Lib Dems are not a single issue party, a quote, UKIP in reverse. Now, another noticeable policy that came was the Lib Dems' plans to replace tuition fees and introduce a graduate tax. This seems to be a marked change from the policy of coalition.
And that's not actually a policy yet. What Vince has done is asked David Howard, who used to be our MP for Cambridge, if he would just go and have a look at the whole issue of fees and how that could be dealt with, and come back to conference. And Vince is certainly talking about it being a graduate tax, which in effect it is, because people don't pay anything up front, and they start to pay a certain percentage over a certain threshold. But the fact that it has a number attached to it that you can pay it all off is, I think that is an issue. I think that young people feel that is a difficult thing. But I think that it's sensible for the party to address something that has become a problem for us. We made a massive mistake with that, and I think we need to show that we're trying to do something about it. And I think it's a mistake that we are never likely to repeat, put it that way.
Is this really a case of the party drawing a line underneath the coalition years and moving on, as it were?
I don't think we entirely want to move on. I think we have two people as our leader and deputy leader who were incredibly competent ministers. Vince as business secretary for 5 years and Joe working with him in the department. But between the two of them, they did some great stuff. Green Investment Bank, industrial strategy, shared parental leave, loads of new consumer rights. These people know how government works, and they're credible ministers. And in fact, we have more former ministers on our front bench than Jeremy Corbyn has. So we have that experience of government, and we did some really good things. Cutting tax bills for the lowest paid and giving extra money for disadvantaged kids in school. All that stuff was really, really good. So we don't want to walk away from that because that's something we can be proud of. And I think when history comes to look back at that coalition government, actually, it was probably the most functional government of my lifetime.
Now, this governmental experience is certainly a contrast to the somewhat populist political environment that has certainly taken over in recent years. Do you see the Lib Dems as sort of a force against this rising populism, or perhaps?
Absolutely. I think we know that there are a lot of dangers around from people promising very simple solutions to very complex problems. Everything will be fine if we just get out of the EU. Everything will be fine if we just get rid of those immigrants. It's awful. It's just awful. It's so untrue and it's so deceptive. And I think part of what Vince is trying to do is trying to tackle the real dissatisfaction that people feel with their lives and the struggles that they've got, and really do something concrete to tackle inequality. And because he understands every little bit about how the economy works, he can do that without bankrupting the country. Jeremy Corbyn is as much a populist of the left by saying, we can do everything and never have to pay for it. And we can see how well that kind of philosophy has worked in places like Venezuela. And I don't think that's necessarily going that's certainly not going to be a good thing for the country. But I think you've got with Vince, you have got that combination of a real drive to make this country fairer, and also understanding how to do it without bankrupting us. And that's a winning combination, I think.
And finally, before we finish, of course, you mentioned Jo Swinson returned to Parliament in the election this year after losing her seat in 2015. She was perhaps the favourite to become the party's new leader until she chose to pull out. Then obviously Sir Vince Cable became leader. Do you see her as a future leader of the Liberal Democrats?
I think Jo is one of the most talented politicians in the country. I know her well. I campaigned for her in 2005 when she won her seat as a 25-year-old. I've seen the drive and the determination that she's got. I absolutely, the way that she has advanced the cause of feminism and the way that she has, been a fantastically competent minister. I think that there are great things ahead for Jo. And she is probably one of my favourite people in the world.
Caron Lindsay, Lib Dem activist and the editor of Lib Dem Voice, thank you for being on today's show.
Thanks.
And of course, if you'd like to follow Caron on Twitter, you can through her handle @CaronM.Lindsay. Well, that was our show. I'd again like to thank Caron Lindsay, editor of Lib Dem Voice and Lib Dem activist, for coming onto the show. I'm Sam Scribala, and we'll be back soon for more Politics World.